Okay, so you guys wanted to dive into what's happening with drugs in the Philippines right now.
Right.
And wow, this podcast episode you sent, The Return of the Narcos.
Yeah.
It's got me a little uneasy, to be honest.
Yeah, I can see why.
Like we think, okay, we dealt with that problem, it's gone away,
Right.
and then boom, it's back, and it's back with a vengeance, it sounds like.
And they really lean into that feeling of this, resurfacing threat.
Yeah.
They use really strong language like cancer,
Mm-hmm.
well-oiled machine,
Yeah.
almost like this idea that it's a
Deeply rooted.
deeply rooted, just woven into the fabric of the country.
And what really gets me is this whole thing about these drug lords coming back for revenge.
Yeah.
Like they're targeting officials now. It's not just about the drugs anymore. It's personal.
It's personal. It's a power move.
Right.
And I think that's what's so fascinating is that it's a tactic that we see with organized crime
Yeah.
throughout history and across the globe.
Hmm.
It's about destabilizing. It's about sending a message. We're still in control even if you don't see us.
Right.
It's that undermining of the rule of law itself that's really chilling.
I mean, it's like The Godfather, but in paradise,
Right.
which is kind of a messed up thought.
Yeah, not the paradise you want to be in.
No, not at all.
But I think when they keep calling it a quiet war,
Yeah, what does that even mean?
what does that look like?
Right.
And that's where things get really unsettling because it's not just about shootouts in the streets.
Yeah.
Although the podcast does suggest those are happening too.
Okay.
It's about influence in the courts, in businesses,
Yeah.
even within the government itself.
Wow.
And, thinking back to Duterte's crackdown a few years ago,
Yeah, I remember that.
which was controversial,
It was.
but it did seem to disrupt the drug trade for a while, at least on the surface.
Yeah, it seemed like something was happening.
Right.
Yeah.
So this idea of a quiet war suggests that those figures who maybe went into hiding during the crackdown,
Mm-hmm.
they might be back,
Oh.
and they might be finding ways to reclaim their power.
So they're playing the long game.
They're playing the long game, and maybe in even more insidious ways than before.
So it's like they lay low, they wait for things to die down, and then they infiltrate the very systems that are supposed to be keeping them in check.
Exactly.
That's terrifying.
It is, and it becomes about more than just drugs at that point.
Right.
It becomes about who truly holds the reins of power in a society.
Yeah, it's like who's really in control here?
Exactly.
And then on top of all of this, the podcast is saying it's up to everyday Filipinos to fight back.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
this is a call to action, almost a moral obligation.
It is. And the language they use is really interesting, too.
Uh-huh.
It's very evocative,
Hmm.
silenced by fear, lives lost.
Right.
It's an appeal to emotion, for sure.
Yeah.
It's about making this about shared values, about the soul of the Philippines, not just a law enforcement issue.
Which I have to say is a really powerful way to frame it.
It is.
Because it becomes something much bigger than just stopping criminals.
Right.
It's at saving your your country.
Absolutely. And I think that framing that call to action is something we need to unpack a little bit more.
Okay, so let's see. We've got a potential resurgence of these powerful drug lords,
Yeah.
a quiet war happening on multiple fronts,
Right.
and a plea to the citizens to step up.
It's a lot.
This is less like a news story and more like a movie plot.
It's a thriller.
Yeah, it is.
But it highlights a real dilemma that many countries face. How do you combat this deeply rooted corruption, these
Yeah.
criminal networks,
Right.
without then further destabilizing the very institutions you're trying to protect?
Right, because you can't just topple everything.
Exactly.
You have to be careful.
It's a tightrope walk with huge stakes.
It is. And the thing is with this podcast, we're only getting one side of the story.
That's a really vital point, I think.
Yeah.
While it raises some very serious concerns, it's important to remember this is just one perspective,
Okay.
one lens through which we're viewing this very complex situation.
So are there other perspectives then?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, what are some other ways to explain what's happening in the Philippines?
Well, there are definitely other voices out there, and I think exploring those is going to be key to getting a more complete understanding of what's going on.
Right, because maybe there's another side to this whole Narcos are back story.
Exactly.
Or maybe it's even more complicated than that.
Right, and that's what makes this so interesting.
Okay, so before we go down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
let's just back up for a second and make sure we're clear on what this podcast is claiming. They're saying drug lords are back big time.
Yeah.
They're out for revenge against officials,
Right.
and they're waging this quiet war to regain control.
And it's not just about violence.
Right, you said they're infiltrating institutions, manipulating systems.
Exactly, undermining the rule of law itself.
And then they're saying this isn't just a job for the authorities.
Right.
It's every citizen's duty to take a stand.
Yeah, and they frame that fight in very moral terms,
Yeah.
appealing to those shared values, that sense of community,
Yeah.
the identity of the Philippines.
Yeah, okay.
It's a powerful narrative, for sure. But as with any story, we have to look at it from multiple angles.
Right, right.
We need those diverse perspectives, and
Mhm.
we need to engage with all of this information critically.
And that is exactly what we're going to do next.
So, we've been talking about this podcast and its claims, but are there other people saying, hey, hold on a minute?
Right. Are there other sides to this story?
Yeah, exactly. Because not everyone's buying into this whole, the narcos are back and they're out for blood narrative.
Okay, so what are some of the other explanations then?
Well, there were some experts who say that this podcast is way too simplistic,
Yeah.
you know.
Like, it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, the Philippines has always had a problem with corruption and crime. It's not like this is anything new.
Right. It's been going on for a long time.
Exactly. So to just blame everything on these drug lords coming back, it ignores everything else that's going on.
So what else is going on then? What are some of the other factors?
Well, for one thing, there's a lot of internal political fighting going on.
Okay.
Different groups struggling for power and influence.
So it's like a power struggle within the government itself.
Exactly. And some people say that this violence that we're seeing, it's not because of drug lords, it's because of these power struggles.
Oh, so it's like different factions within the government fighting each other.
Exactly. And then you've got to factor in the economics of it all.
Right, because the economy plays a huge role.
Huge role. And the Philippines is still recovering from the pandemic, right?
Yeah, things have been tough for a lot of people.
Exactly. And when people are desperate, when they're struggling to make ends meet, crime rates go up.
Right, because people will do whatever it takes to survive.
Exactly. And that's true no matter who's in charge or who's calling the shots.
So it's like all of these different things are happening at the same time.
It's a perfect storm.
Right, political instability, economic hardship, and then maybe this resurgence of the drug trade.
Right. And that's exactly why we can't just accept one side of the story as the whole truth.
It's like looking at a puzzle, but only seeing a few pieces.
Exactly. We need all of the pieces to really understand what's going on.
Okay, so we've got this podcast painting a very alarming picture.
Right.
But we also have to consider that they might have an agenda.
Of course they're trying to get people to listen.
Right, so maybe they're exaggerating things for dramatic effect.
Yeah. Or maybe they're leaving out information that doesn't fit their narrative.
And that's where critical thinking comes in.
Exactly. We can't just switch our brains off and believe everything we hear.
Right, we have to question things, think for ourselves.
Exactly. And that doesn't mean we dismiss the podcast entirely.
Right.
But we have to look at it with a healthy dose of skepticism.
So, like, how do we do that? How do we become more critical thinkers?
Well, first of all, we need to diversify our news sources.
Okay, so don't just rely on one place for information.
Exactly. Look at international news organizations, read academic journals, even look at blogs and social media from experts.
So basically look everywhere.
Cast a wide net, and when you see different viewpoints, don't just ignore them.
Yeah, try to understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. What kind of evidence are they using? What are their assumptions?
And even if you don't agree with them, at least you've seen the issue from a different angle.
Exactly. It's all about broadening our understanding.
It reminds me of that saying, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know.
It's very true, and it keeps things interesting.
It does.
That sense of curiosity is so important, especially with these complex global issues.
So we've gone from drug lords to critical thinking to media literacy.
It's all connected.
It's like this whole other layer of understanding.
And it's about empowering ourselves to form our own opinions.
Instead of just accepting what we're told.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about different perspectives. We've talked about thinking critically. But there's still this big question looming. What happens if this quiet war is real?
What are the implications?
Yeah, what does it mean for the Philippines? What does it mean for the rest of the world?
That's where things get really interesting.
So we're talking about the Philippines, right? But this isn't just some isolated thing, is it?
Right. This isn't just a local problem.
If this quiet war is really happening, like the podcast says, it's got to have consequences for everything.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
If the rule of law is compromised even a little bit by these criminals, it affects everything.
It impacts everything. Trade relies on stable partners,
Right.
Foreign investment dries up if there's too much risk, if things feel unstable.
And there are already so many global players in that region.
Right.
China, the U.S., everyone's got interests there.
It's a tinderbox.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like one wrong move could set everything off.
And, if organized crime gets a stronger foothold there,
Yeah.
it emboldens similar groups in other vulnerable countries.
Oh, wow. So it's like a domino effect.
It's like a disease that spreads if it's not contained.
Okay, that's a whole other level of scary.
Yeah.
And speaking of scary, the podcast ended on this really intense note.
Oh, yeah. The warrior's call.
It felt almost like propaganda, you
It was
know?
very powerful imagery.
Yeah, and I get it, it's a serious issue, but it also felt a little manipulative.
I think it speaks to how deeply personal this issue is for a lot of Filipinos.
Right, of course.
But that kind of rhetoric, it can be dangerous if it's not balanced with,
With other perspectives, with critical thinking, because
Right.
it's easy to get swept up in fear and anger.
It is, and that's when things can go really wrong.
Right, vigilance is one thing, but mob mentality, that's a whole different beast.
Absolutely. We have to be careful about blind faith in any narrative.
Even if it sounds like it's coming from a good place.
Exactly. Because even good intentions can lead to bad outcomes
Yeah.
if we don't think critically about the information we're consuming.
Man, this whole deep dive has been quite a journey. I mean, we started out talking about drug lords, and now we're talking about global power struggles and media manipulation.
It's all connected, though.
It really is.
And that's what makes these conversations so important.
Yeah, we have to be willing to follow the thread wherever it leads.
Exactly.
So to everyone listening, if this got you thinking, keep digging.
Yeah. Don't stop here.
Find those different perspectives. Keep asking questions.
The world needs more informed, engaged citizens.
Couldn't agree more. Well said.
Especially now when it's getting harder and harder to tell what's true and what's not.
That's the truth right there.
Right.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, until next time, stay curious.